Part 20. Bree Canyon Road. There was a light, a bright light, searing like the sun. It split the night landscape and licked over the shattered concrete shapes, etching razor-sharp shadows. There was wind, too, blasting straight down, and a screaming sound, like metal dying, and she realized it was a jet engine, or engines. The downblast whipped the ash drifts, exposing a jackstraw heap of bones. Ash was blasted from the sockets of skulls, and shadows from the searchlights tracked across the empty orbits in a parody of life. The machine was like an enormous chrome wasp, except that where the wings would be, at the center of the thorax, there were two turbojet housings aimed straight down. The thing hovered and dipped, scanning on visual and infrared frequencies. Then it banked, nosing down and picking up airspeed like an Air Cobra helicopter. Its underslung gun fired once into a burned-out building, and then retracted into the belly nacelle as the craft continued its patrol. A kilometre away, across the blasted landscape, another of the machines was settling to Earth on insectile hydraulic legs in what looked like a depot or staging area. There were several of the tank-like ground HKs parked under the reflective infrared floodlights. On tapered concrete pylons, 20 metres long, automated cannons stood guard, with tiny anti-personnel machine guns swivelling beneath them. Searchlights swept the darkness. When the flying HK had passed, it was safe to emerge. In their mottled, two-tone grey camis, the troopers blended perfectly with the environment. Grey on grey, black on black. The leader lay prone under an angled slab of concrete, and he was looking through a scope attached to his rifle, an image-intensified video screen on which the landscape glowed bright as day. The green glow lit his face. It was Reese. Sweat trickled down, leaving clear streaks in the layer of ash on his face. He was dirty and hadn't shaved lately, and none of the other troopers looked much better. They all wore headsets, and there was a constant low murmur of communication from other units in the area. LRRP Team Yankee 1-3 to Firebase Echo 9er. Come in, Yankee 1-3, what's your stat? Concluded sweep to the 3,000 metre line. Didn't see much. Ran into some scavs out at the shopping mall. They're unregistered, but they got some stuff to trade. What sort of stuff? Canned food, some tools and gasoline. They need shelter and some 223 ammo. Roger 1-3, send them on down. We're coming in. Our spotter's got a bad paw, so I'm cutting the patrol short. Roger 1-3. The voices murmured incessantly. Reports of patrols in all nearby sectors, sapper teams looking for HKs to disable and salvage components from, a long-range recon team on the run from a new Mark 8 aerial. It was zigging when they zigged, and it didn't look good. A unit up in the hills, near Bunker 23 on Old Mulholland Drive, was requesting a mech team to help unship the cannon from a salvageable HK. Someone out by the beach had gotten into it with a couple of Series 600 Terminators dressed in trooper camis. The result was 1 deader, 3 for the medevac, and 2 burning Terminator chassis. Their spotter, a Beagle, had boarded as well, and the team leader was disconsolate. And so on. Reese signalled a move, and the unit descended through a manhole hidden by debris into a stairwell that led downward. Sarah's mind's eye moved with them as they trooped wearily into the earth, down level after level, guided by a flashlight beam. 4 levels below the surface, Reese pounded on a crudely welded steel door with the butt of his rifle. Once, twice more, then once again. A steel plate grated as it slid aside, and a sentry's eyes appeared at the slot-like opening. Reese, Kyle, DN... The door clanged and rolled open before he finished. Reese entered. Warmth, fire smoke, and cloying human body smells assailed him. 3 armed sentries stood inside, weapons raised. Reese held his hand out to be sniffed by the 2 sentry dogs, a shepherd and a Doberman. Probably the most well-fed creatures at the firebase. Their tails wagged, and Reese was past. Still human. The sentries stepped back, relaxing the grips on their Westinghouse M25s. Reese's squad entered, signed in at the duty station, set up on an old card table, and then separated into the labyrinth. Firebase E9. It had once been D-level of the parking structure under the ABC Entertainment Center in Century City. Now it was shattered, partially collapsed, and the home of soldiers, children, scavengers, the sick and dying, and lots of rats. Sarah seemed to be moving with Reese, as if he were her guide. They passed emaciated, haunted faces, whose eyes flicked, barely registering their passing. They were dressed in scavenged rags, layers of mismatched clothing, sizes too large or too small, cloaks or vests made of long shag carpet, canvas, black plastic, held together with multicolored bits of wire. Their faces were pale and pinched, eyes hollow. Only the children seemed to have any life as they scurried in the shadows, catching rats for the stew pot. The catacombs flickered with small cook fires, and everywhere faces peered from the shadows like ghosts, men and women whose souls had fled. They were living in the hulks of cars, steel trash dumpsters turned on their sides, or maybe just behind a ragged blanket hung on a wire. Some of the older faces showed scarring from flash burns received during the war. Their flesh melted and bubbled like burned cheese. A thin wail drifted from somewhere in the darkness, and from a niche nearby, a mindlessly repeated dry sobbing droned on and on. It was a walk through hell, and Sarah was torn between an overwhelming urge to flee and the intense desire to help in any way she could to ease the desperate suffering. As she walked among them, she reached out, as if she could crush them to her breast and make them well. All the poor nuclear children. But it was as if she were the ghost, because they looked right through her. She wasn't there. Not yet. Reese and Sarah approached a group of men huddled around a transmitter base station, under a bright fluorescent light. Reese saluted as he passed. There was a lot of brass. Some he knew, some he didn't. Several captains, 2 majors, and a figure seated with his back to them, flanked by guards. He wore a black beret with a general star pinned to the side. Only one man in the motley guerrilla army that spanned the globe wore a black beret like that. John had come to this firebase the previous night to organise a raid on the nearby automated factories. It was known that Skynet produced the chain-fed plasma cannons used in the Mark 7s and 8s. A big raid, scheduled 3 days hence. Reese was looking forward to it. One of the lieutenants had mentioned that Reese might be up for a transfer to Connor's personal unit, and John himself had actually spoken to him shortly after arriving. It had been a curious meeting, with Reese feeling self-conscious as Connor gave him a slow, careful scrutiny. It was as if Connor had been sizing him up in some way, beyond the ordinary evaluation of an officer. Whether Reese was wanting was not revealed in Connor's eyes. "Carry on, Sergeant," the general had said, and turned away. It was always that way with John, and although Reese had served in action with him several times, the man remained an enigma. Now, surrounded by his staff, John was coordinating a dozen major offensives throughout the world via his mobile telecommunications unit. Reese had been told that they actually pirated channels off Skynet's own satellites, knowing the enemy would destroy anything men could put up there, but that it couldn't afford to destroy its own global relay system. Reese didn't have a clue how that stuff worked, but that wasn't his job anyway. Sarah saw the men crowded together in a pool of light. She saw the figure in the black beret as 2 of his aides stepped aside. His back was to her. His broad shoulders drooped wearily, but his hands moved with sure strokes, indicating actions on a battle map. She could hear his voice, but not the words, and she wished he would turn. But the aides moved together, and he was blocked from view again. She wanted to go to him, but found it impossible. He was something she wasn't meant to see. Reese moved on and found a place to bunk down for a few hours, a half-burned leather couch. He unbuckled his web belt then unslung his rifle and laid it across his knees, keeping his hand on it. "My lover and my best friend," he said to her, patting the buttstock of the M25. "We always sleep together." Sarah sat beside him on the couch. He leaned back, his body leadened. Opening a zippered pouch, he removed the small, flat, plastic rectangle. It was a crumpled Polaroid photo, but she couldn't see the picture. As Rhys studied it, his gaze grew soft and distant. He held it motionless for a long time. Rhys glanced up as he heard the security door being unlocked and opened. Another patrol was coming through, visible in the distance under the dim portable fluorescence. 2 scouts. The dogs were smelling their hands. Then another man pushed through before the sentries could close the door. He was a head taller than the others and carried something bulky under his torn grey poncho. The dogs began barking furiously at the last man. The sentries were already going for their weapons. One was yelling, "Terminator! Terminator!" Rhys hung frozen for half a second as the Terminator threw back its poncho and lifted the General Dynamics RBS-80 to fire. The weapon cracked and the bunker was seared with light. Rhys gripped the precious photograph in his teeth to free his hands and leapt up with his rifle, sprinting towards the action. A terrifying series of blinding pulses lit the bunker as the Terminator sprayed the interior with lethal fire. Screams punctuated the concussive blasts, and a siren began its maniacal hooting. In the middle of the smoke and pandemonium, the Terminator was moving with frightening precision towards the command center. Connor was barking orders. Return fire was zapping all around the Terminator. Some ammo exploded. The scene became obscured by a fireball rolling across the low ceiling. Rhys had been flung to the floor, beneath a rain of flaming debris. He rolled, stunned by pain, groping for his rifle. The photo had fallen nearby and lay burning amid some other debris. Sarah watched Rhys looking at the Polaroid, his eyes glazing with shock as it shriveled in the flames. Now it was only impressions, screams, running feet, power bolts lighting up the smoke like flashbulbs. A 6-year-old girl crying amid the chaos, the dogs whining and howling. One of them, the shepherd, snarling and biting at its own back, where the fur was ablaze. And in the middle of it, a relentlessly moving silhouette with glowing red eyes, its gun speaking death. The RBS-80 wheeled around, its massive barrel aimed right towards her. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she knew she couldn't dodge fast enough. She stared, paralyzed, for the microsecond before it fired, which dilated into a century. The red eyes fixed on her. Then white light blasted her being into mist. The dream had no place to go from there, and it stopped abruptly, like the end of a film flapping through a projector. Sarah moaned, coming half awake, and clutched at Rhys, turning towards the warmth of his body. Then she subsided back into full sleep, this time without dreams. Rhys felt Sarah stir, and it jerked him awake. He realized he'd almost drowsed off and went through a couple of quick mental exercises he used on long patrols to stay awake. The sky outside the culvert was beginning to lighten. He must have talked for a long time. He realized he'd probably said more words in an hour than in the previous 2 years of his life. Why he'd gone into such detail about that attack on the bunker, he couldn't immediately say. It was certainly a common enough occurrence, unremarkable from a military standpoint. He had been trying to give her an overview of his world, so it served as a bit of everyday life in AD 2029. Maybe the picture had something to do with it. The combination of the picture and the Terminator and John's being there. Somehow these elements made the whole thing vivid. John had given him the picture originally, a year before, when they were hunkered down in a storm drain, much like this one, and the ground shook from plasma bombs that poured artificial daylight in on them intermittently. John had taken a leather case out of his fatigue pocket, an old pre-war billfold, and from it he produced the Polaroid. What it meant, or why Reese should carry it, was never mentioned, and it still remained a mystery. Reese had recognised the face immediately, of course, for there were lots of pictures of Sarah Connor available, and some soldiers even carried them in battle, for luck. But to have an original Polaroid meant a great deal more. He had carried it with him everywhere after that, even on bad missions where he was bound to get soaked to the bone, or worse. The picture was seared into his memory as a result, though the image itself was enigmatic. She seemed to be sitting in some sort of vehicle. There wasn't enough of it in the frame to identify. Her hair was different than now, though she seemed about the same age, maybe a little older. It was shorter and bound by a headband. Her features were slightly drawn, but there was a set to her jaw that radiated strength, and her eyes gave the impression of inner calmness. Her lips were curved in the faintest vestige of a smile, perhaps a smile of remembrance, but the overall effect was almost sombre. The overcast sky added to that. There was something behind her, out of focus. It was a long time before Reese had recognised it as the shoulder and flank of a dog, probably a German shepherd, judging by the size and coloration. When he got to the part about the Terminator entering the bunker while he was gazing at the photo, he had skipped over mentioning that it was a likeness of her. He had felt a rush of embarrassment, as if it would be an admission of some strange voyeurism to tell her that. Even his pragmatic honesty couldn't overcome that. He thought of the explosion that had stunned him, and how his first image, as his eyes refocused, had been of her picture burning nearby. When a Polaroid burns, it shrinks, shrivels, and distorts, although the image is still visible, melting and mutating. He glanced down at the real Sarah, lying now in his lap, lost in a troubled sleep. He felt that strange dislocation and double image as he gazed at her features. Déjà vu. Like when a terrain map is memorized before a mission, and then later, crawling through the actual area, there is a sense of the abstract overlaid on the real. The preparation for an event, becoming the event. He sucked in the cold morning air. Sunlight washed the grey cement of the drainage culvert a harsh white. Sarah stirred and murmured. Her face was turned up to him, opened in innocent sleep. He followed the simple lines of Sarah's geometry. Despite a face puffy with sleep, mouth slack, one cheek crushed against his soiled shirt, and although her expression now was far from noble, she was beautiful. He traced her nose with the tip of his finger and ran it lightly across her full lips. They yielded to his touch. There had been nothing as soft in his whole miserable life. A feeling like a miniature copter blade churning in his chest caused his breath to quicken and his hand to tremble. Reese's whole body was a mass of aches, but he didn't care. A nasty cramp was forming in his left calf. He ignored it. The feeling had gone out of the arm supporting Sarah. He hated that. She was in his arms, but he could only half feel her. He gingerly moved a strand of hair off her cheek. Sarah wrinkled her nose and sighed. He could feel the warm exhalation, smell the sweetness. Reese clamped down, willed his head to clear. Sarah opened her eyes and refocused on Reese. "I was dreaming about dogs," she said, sounding puzzled. The dream was a churning blur of terrifying shadows. "I told you about them last night," he explained. "We use them to spot Terminators." At the mention of Terminators, Sarah rose completely to the now placid surface of consciousness, and in memory looked back at the distant, choppy maelstrom she had passed through last night. "Oh, God," she said. But it wasn't a prayer.